Social reform continued in the beginning of the 20th century. In 1902, the newspapers started exposing the social evil of the times with much exaggeration. President Roosevelt called them muckrakers. Progressivism, or the social reform movement, thrived. Women were able to involve themselves in women's clubs that worked for the same cause. To please the males who thought it not a woman's place, they took up the idea of social work being an extension of their mothering. They and others also took up the temperance movement. President Roosevelt stood up for workers the first time during the anthracite coal strike, when he threatened non-cooperative owners with federal troops. He also subdued large trusts, but his successor Taft smashed many more. The Meat Inspection Act was passed in 1906 after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the unsanitary practices. Also passed in 1906 was the Pure Food and Drug Act. Roosevelt had sworn in 1904 that he would not accept another term, but for his successor he blessed William Howard Taft. However, Taft did not turn out to be the heavier clone of Roosevelt. He was much more passive. He did attack the U.S. Steel Corporation Trust, though. Because Roosevelt had been personally involved in it, relations between himself and his former protege were tense. So tense that Roosevelt allowed himself to run for a third term, justifying his previous aversion to it by saying he would not run for 3 terms consecutively. Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 election for the Democrats, facing Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft, candidates who split the Republican vote. Roosevelt's new nationalism platform consisted of strong government involvement as well as women's suffrage and social welfare. Wilson's new freedom also favored strong government involvement, but favored small business and laissez-faire economics. Wilson was a skilled orator, a son of a minister who appealed to the masses instead of Congress. However, he was arrogant about his knowledge and treated individuals poorly. He was also very self-righteous and always had to be right. Wilson abhorred 3 things: the tariff, the bank, and the trusts, and vowed to destroy them. To begin, he gave his own presidential message. In turn, the Underwood Tariff Bill was passed, lowering the tariff considerably and levying a graduated income tax. To tackle the bank, Wilson created a kind of third national bank, which, combined with the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, created a board to preside over 12 regional reserve districts, each with its own central bank. This board could also issue Federal Reserve notes, the loophole in the Constitution that the government could not print money. The final evil Wilson wished to combat was the trusts. In 1914, Congress passed the Federal Trade Commission Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. From the start, it seemed Wilson implemented the ideas of Roosevelt and Taft combined, but when it came to foreign policy, he was against their planks. He ended dollar diplomacy overseas and ended most imperialism expansions. In 1914, a war broke out between the Allies and Germany. Wilson kept America neutral until 1917, when the Germans killed many Americans. In 1916, he was already elected. In 1917, President Wilson was forced to enter America into World War I. This involvement was advertised to make the world safe for democracy, and with that, American citizens were enthralled. In 1918, Wilson delivered a 14-point speech to Congress to encourage and inspire the Allies. The Committee on Public Information was headed by George Creel, with the sole purpose of making Americans passionate about the war and Wilson. This passion aroused anti-German sentiment, and the Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 made sure Americans were loyal. Americans also started working harder, and there were less strikes. However, the right to form unions was not granted. With the African Americans who migrated to work in the factories came race riots. Women also worked more outside of the home, and it was this involvement that indirectly led to the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Victory gardens began springing up, and Congress restricted the use of foodstuffs and alcohol. The 18th Amendment was passed in 1919. Finally, in 1918, the Germans surrendered, conquered more by the threat of the U.S. rather than its performance. To negotiate the peace, Wilson went to France. He did not take any Republicans, basically ensuring his defeat in the next election. During the peace negotiations, Wilson's long-term goal was a League of Nations, which the Republicans shot down. After the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, a small group of communists sprang up. From 1919 to 1920 was called the Red Scare. Men like General Palmer, the Fighting Quaker, started blaming the Russians and communism for everything. It also hindered the labor unions. A new KKK was formed. With the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1919, crime and illicit activities grew. Mobs and gangs were popular. Al Capone was a large player in this game. So good, he only got caught for tax evasion. Also in the 20s came educational and scientific advances. Tennessee and 2 other states tried to put laws in place to ban the teaching of evolution. The Scopes trial outcome did not legalize these bans. As the economy flourished, so did industry, especially that of automobile production. Sports and credit became increasingly popular as well. The standard of living began rising. Aviation began taking flight as well. New advances in radio and films gave people something different to do. Dress became less modest for women, and jazz, the music of the times. American literature and plays began to change as well. Warren G. Harding became president in 1921. His administration was full of corruptions his simple mind could not or would not detect. Harding aimed to put laissez-faire into effect again. Many rights previously won by women and unions were stripped. After the war, Americans reverted to labor strikes and unpreparedness for war. Veterans also demanded more compensation. The tariff was raised to an almost unprecedented rate, with the 1922 Fordney-McCumber tariff law. One of the biggest scandals of Harding's administration was the Teapot Dome scandal. Land with precious oil reserved for the Navy was secretly moved to the Interior Department, and many a bribe was offered and accepted. As more scandals surfaced, Harding went on tour giving speeches. He died of pneumonia on the return trip. Vice President Silent Cal Coolidge took the oath and was honest, moral, and frugal. He was very uninvolved in big business and did not restrict. Also, with the end of the war came the lowering of prices on agriculture because of overproduction. The 1924 election had 3 main candidates: Coolidge for the Republicans, Davis for the Democrats, and La Follette for the Progressives. Coolidge was re-elected. Where foreign policy was concerned, America was highly isolated. The only place American troops stayed was the Caribbean and Central America. War debts in Europe were almost impossible to be paid back. However, the U.S. began loaning money to the Allies to pay their loans to the U.S. and to Germany to pay the Allies. In the 1928 election, Republicans won with their candidate Hoover. Under Hoover, wage earners and farmers were dealt the unfair hand. In 1929, the Federal Farm Board was created to help farmers help themselves. As the world economy took a nosedive, Adolf Hitler's rise to power became more and more imminent. In October of 1929, the inevitable stock market bust became reality. It later became known as the Great Depression. Along with economic failure were natural disasters. President Hoover was disgraced. There were no jobs, and banks were taking homes back. Hoover's solution was to provide aid to railroads, banks, and credit corporations in hopes that the profit would move down the ladder. He also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided jobs in Reconstruction. Veterans searched for a way out of their plight by demanding their entire bonuses. The Bonus Expeditionary Force marched on Washington, only leaving when brutally forced by the Army. While the U.S. was held up in its own affairs, Japan attacked Manchuria, China. The League of Nations did physically nothing. Hoover was blamed for the onslaught of the Depression, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the new savior. He was elected in 1932, and many of his policies favored the poor. For this reason, the African American vote shifted to the Democrats. Silver-tongued Roosevelt brought about a New Deal. and the three R's, relief, recovery, and reform, were to be its pillars. In the first 100 days after his election, Roosevelt called a special session of Congress which passed over 10 acts to overcome the Depression. In 1933, there was a drought in the Midwest, creating dangerous dust bowls that caused many Okies and Arkies to move to California. FDR and his brain trust passed the Social Security Act of 1935, giving most of America monetary protection and aid. Unions were also given more rights, and a Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. A major blunder of Roosevelt's was trying to pack the Supreme Court. 7 out of the major 9 cases concerning the New Deal had been thwarted, so FDR mistakenly took matters into his own hands. The populace was enraged, but the Supreme Court did reform. At the end of his final term, Roosevelt was no longer a godsend, but rather another magician who had run out of tricks. FDR had ignored the world's problems during the American Depression, but foreign involvement was soon placed on the doorstep. In 1933, the London Economic Conference met, and Roosevelt withdrew America because he believed it was in the U.S.'s best interests. The Soviet Union was officially recognized in 1933. Roosevelt implemented the Good Neighbor policy and began non-intervention. In 1934, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was passed to increase and make trade more efficient. Across the sea, the Tripartite Pact aligned Germany, Italy, and Japan. Mussolini, dictator of Italy, attacked Ethiopia. The world began to panic that it was a foreshadowing, but America was still declared neutral. When England was the only country left in Europe for Hitler to attack, Roosevelt underhandedly aided Britain, breaking the neutrality. An election was held in 1940. Roosevelt decided to run for a third term against Wendell Willkie and won. Also in 1940, the Lend-Lease Bill was passed. It loaned money and weaponry to victims of atrocities that, in theory, was to be returned after the war. In 1941, Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact by attacking Russia. Hitler also began attacking American ships with his U-boats. Meanwhile, an embargo was placed on Japan. Rapidly losing supplies, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor December 7, 1941. Official war was declared December 11th. World War II ended the New Deal era, and America was transformed into an industrial giant. Women and foreigners took the places of those called for duty by the draft. Because of the racial intermingling, several serious clashes ensued. The war greatly improved the Americans' economy and ended the Depression. However, the national debt skyrocketed. America and the Allies, even after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, focused on Germany, but diverted some attention to the Pacific. Japan seemed to gain momentum rapidly, but after their many victories, they became overconfident. Meanwhile, Hitler's U-boats became highly lethal until the British cracked their codes. With help from angered Russia, Hitler's dreams were brought to a halt. Italy unconditionally surrendered, and the bloody fight was brought to Italian lands. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched an invasion of French Normandy. Another presidential election was also in 1944. FDR was nominated for a 4th time against Republican Dewey. Roosevelt won because America was winning the war. Germany made one final lunge at America in the Battle of the Bulge, but failed. The war ended on May 7, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender, but President Roosevelt had died April 12. Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed the executive position. Now that Hitler had been defeated, one was left of Axis: Japan. The U.S. became master of the Pacific Seas and recaptured many of the islands occupied by Japan. An ultimatum was given to Japan: surrender or be destroyed. The first American atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico, and 2 more were subsequently dropped on Japan when they would not unconditionally surrender. An agreement was made that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to remain as figurehead, but Japan would surrender. The Allies were successful after billions of dollars and millions of lives.